an awkward Christmas. And this morning, I want to talk about an awkward situation. Don't we hate those awkward situations? And they happen to us all the time. This morning, there was like 3 of them already. Right? Just in the service this morning, there's 3 of them. I feel sorry for Hank. Mic wouldn't work. So Hank's up here trying to do the Advent reading with a mic that's going in and out. So what do? Well, you stand there awkwardly until another mic comes. You're trying to light the candle. The lighter doesn't want to light the candle. What do? You stand there awkwardly fighting to get the candle to light. Right? So it's awkward upon awkward. And awkward situations, they seem to plague us sometimes. I remember my first church. I was getting all ready to preach. I was dressed up like I am now, all fancy kind of like, and no tie though. I didn't do ties. Right? But I was all dressed up. I was ready to preach, and I was holding. I think it was Natalie I was holding, and I had her up on my shoulder, and I was walking around with her, just going to hand her off to Sarah, and she spit up on my shoulder. Like, okay, so my baby spit up on my shoulder. That's okay, and Sarah's here cleaning off my shoulder before I go to preach. Well, what made it awkward was when I realized I'm not standing at the back of the church. I'm standing like up in the front corner where Aaron and Trevor are right now. The whole church is looking at me as Sarah's cleaning off my shoulder of all the spit. When that happened, I'm like, okay, this is just so awkward. And to this day, it still feels awkward. Well, these awkward situations, you can't avoid them. They're going to happen. And sometimes they have to happen. Our story today is Joseph, and Joseph, he had his awkward situation. He was put into a middle of a very big, awkward situation. In our reading today, I want to point out a couple of things about this situation that Joseph found himself in. Now, we all know the story. We read about it last week because Mary got the awkward invitation. Right? And we studied that, and we looked at that, and we know the angel came down, told Mary, hey, you're going to have a child. Okay? This is going to be from God. You're going to have Jesus. So Mary's like, okay, cool. I'm going to have baby Jesus. Right? Now, go on to this week, where we had the awkward situation where now Joseph is in the loop. Last week it was just Mary. And Mary says, okay, cool. Whatever you say, I'll do. Now Joseph is in the loop. Now, Joseph has just been invited into this situation, and it's extremely awkward. And I want to point out a couple of reasons why it would be awkward. It would be a really awkward situation because at the time, Joseph was trying to follow the law. But before we dive too much into the law, we need to understand something important about Joseph. And really, we know very little about Joseph. Later on in the scriptures, Joseph isn't in the picture, so a lot of commentators believe that Joseph had died before this time. But what we do know about Joseph is this. Joseph was called a just man. And the term just, in the biblical sense, it often denotes someone who lives in accordance with God's law and commandments. So Joseph would have been seen as a man who not only followed the law, but a man who respected the Jewish laws, and he sought to live his life that was pleasing to God. That was his main goal. I want to live a life that's pleasing to God. And this is confirmed in the book of Matthew chapter 1, where we read this. Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law. And the law that Joseph was faithful to was the law of Moses. Okay? Joseph didn't have the New Testament. The New Testament didn't start until later on in Jesus' life. So the law that Joseph was basing his life off of had to be the law of Moses. So you're going back into the book of Deuteronomy. Okay? That's the law that Joseph is basing his life off of. And the book of Deuteronomy, here's what the law says. If a man happens to meet in the town a virgin pledged to be married, that's Joseph's situation, and he sleeps with her, you shall take both of them to the gate of the town and stone them to death. That's in Deuteronomy, chapter 22, 23, and 24. That's the law of Moses. Right? So now we have Joseph, who was a man who was dedicated to following the law, who is in the situation that is directly referenced here in Deuteronomy. And because Joseph had this strong desire to follow the law that was written by Moses, he's now in an awkward situation. Now, along with that, the law also provided for Joseph to divorce Mary quietly. That's another option. So here Joseph is in the middle of this awkward situation. And for Joseph, the right and wrong was very clear. If he based it just off the law, the right action was clear. It was divorce, shame, or stoning. That's the three options. Right? Clear as crystal clear. Now, can you see how awkward this would be for Joseph? Can you kind of put yourself into his situation just for a minute? Because on one hand, you've got the law, the absolute, the thing that Joseph had been following most of his life. That had to put him into this camp here. That had to put him into, I have to do one of these three things. I have to publicly shame her, she has to be stoned, or I got to divorce her. That's my three options. So that's this camp here. But the second camp over here, this camp over here says, but I care for the woman, and where is mercy and grace? Where are they at? So this is a very awkward situation for Joseph. Because if Joseph carries out what the law says, that means punishment, public shaming, divorce, and in some cases death. That was his right. So there wouldn't have been this struggle within Joseph's own mind about what was right. His logical mind would say that's the right course of action. Following the rules is the right course of action. His logical mind would say, I need to follow the law. But then another part of his mind was saying, but where is grace? Where was the caring for Mary on the other hand? If Joseph calls Mary out publicly, which is his right, Deuteronomy says that's your right, take him to the town gate, publicly shame him, that's his right. But if Joseph calls Mary out publicly, which is his right, he would expose her to the full ridicule of the entire community. So these two options in this situation are making Joseph wrestle with the question of what is right. So that's Joseph looking at the law. Now, along with the law, Joseph's also dealing with his own feelings that are in his own head. That is another struggle on its own. And it's an awkward struggle. This is not an easy decision for Joseph to make. It brought up many thoughts and feelings that would make this situation very, very awkward. Now, let's paraphrase this story a little bit. Let's put ourselves into Joseph's position. All right, so Joseph married, Mary is betrothed to Joseph, basically promised to be married, but in the eyes of Jewish law, she's married to Joseph. So one day, Mary comes up to Joseph and says, hey, Joseph, can we talk for a minute? Now, all guys know that when a woman says, can we talk for a minute, you're in trouble. Right? Something's not quite right. Anyway, Mary comes to Joseph and says, hey, can we talk for a minute? And of course, Joseph says, sure. What is it, Mary? And Mary says, well, I'm going to have a baby, and it's not yours. Instant awkward. Okay, what are you talking about, Mary? Oh, Mary says, oh, don't worry about it, Joseph. It's from God. Okay. Can you picture this playing out? Can you picture this conversation, and can you try to picture the thoughts and feelings that are going through Joseph right now? The woman that he loves, the woman that he's planning to spend the rest of his life with, just told him, I'm going to have a baby, which is, bad enough. But don't worry, the baby's not any man's, the baby's from God. Okay, Mary, who's the real dad, and are you crazy? That's the first thoughts that are going to go through his head. What do you do with that statement? What do you do with all those feelings and all those emotions going through? How do you categorize the feelings and thoughts that are rushing through your head at that moment? Man, it's hard to do that, isn't it? The only word that came to my mind was awkward. That's the only word I could put to it, because no other word seemed to fit. But since Joseph was a just and righteous man, the first thought to go through his mind had to be, well, what's the law tell me to do? Right. What's the law's remedy to the situation? Because the remedy that he came up with had to be pleasing to God. And in his own mind, he had to think, well, my rights tell me this. My rights tell me this is my course of action. The law tells me this is my course of action. Society tells me this is my course of action. So it seems like everything is telling me this is my right course of action. But in his own mind, he's wrestling with, is this right? Or is the mercy and grace right? Which way do I go? What do I do? Well, if we look in verse 20, we get an inkling into what Joseph was thinking. Because beginning of verse 20, it says this, but after he had considered this, after he considered the situation, and after he came up with his game plan, he was considering divorcing Mary quietly instead of the public shaming. Now, this is a big step for Joseph. Right? This tells us even more about the man Joseph. Because in order to divorce her quietly, he had to check some things at the door. And what I mean by that was the feelings that he's got, he had to put them off to the side. Because to have the woman that you love come to you and say, oh, Joseph, I'm going to have a baby and it's not yours. Well, that had to bring these feelings of betrayal, of anger, of hurt, disbelief. All these feelings come rushing in. But for Joseph to say, well, my rights say I can take you to the city gates and I can disgrace you publicly. You hurt me, I'm going to hurt you. Hey, that's a human reaction. And I can do it with the law behind me. That's a human reaction. But for Joseph, he sat back, he considered it, he thought it through it all, and he decided, well, instead of doing that, which might make me feel better right now, I'm just going to try to do this as least intrusive on Mary as I can, and I'm just going to do this quietly. Well, I want to camp on this for a second. Because when you read this account in the NIV, it says that Joseph considered this. Well, the NIV, it really doesn't do justice to what's going on in this passage. There's a lot more going on here. Joseph is not just considering something, he's pondering it. Okay? He's really pondering it. Now you might be wondering, well, what's the difference between considering and pondering? Okay? Good question. Just after my surgery, a couple of days afterwards, I was allowed out on an afternoon pass. Some of you saw the pictures on Facebook. I went to the Halifax Shopping Center, got to walk through the mall. I got to sit in the food court, okay, which means I'm going to have good food. Hospital food is okay, but to have my choice of food. So I started looking at all the shops. I saw Tim Hortons, I saw Subway, chicken, and everything I could possibly want. So I started looking around going, I don't want Timmy's right now. no, I don't want chicken. No, I don't want Subway. I'm going to have Thai noodles. And so I decided I'm going to sit down and have some Thai noodles. So I sat down and I had my bowl of Thai noodles and I was happy. Well, you know what? It took me like 5 minutes to consider what food I wanted to eat. It didn't take me hours and days to decide what food I wanted to eat. See, to ponder something, you are really thinking hard over. You're spending a lot of time thinking this. You're going through all the possibilities of this. That's pondering. See, that's what Joseph did in this situation. He sat down and he tried to think through all the possibilities, everything that comes into this situation. The law, his feelings, his love for Mary. He was trying to think through it all to come up with the best possible solution. To put it another way, he was wrestling in his own head what was the right way to respond. He was going back and forth with both of them, and then he finally came up with his right way. As I read this, I couldn't help but thinking, I wish that more people in our community, in our world, would think like Joseph. If people spent more time pondering about how to react to a situation, there'd be far less fights. Wouldn't there? If we just stopped to think for a couple of minutes before responding, how many fights and misunderstandings could we avoid? Quite a few, I'd imagine. See here, Joseph had a right to his feelings. He had a right to feel that he was betrayed, that he was hurt, that he was angered. They're human emotions. So he had a right to his feelings, but that didn't make his feelings right to act on. See the difference there? He had these feelings, and the feelings, you know what, they may have been right, but that doesn't mean it's right to act on those in a negative way. Notice I put negative in there. Right? Those feelings, you got to act on them, but doesn't mean you can do it negatively. In Joseph's mind, Mary had betrayed him, she had disgraced him, she had hurt him, so that natural response would be, to hurt me, I'm going to hurt you back, and I have society on my side, I'm protected. But for Joseph, the right decision was showing grace and kindness to Mary. This tension between law and grace was taking up a lot of Joseph's time. A lot of time. And it's hard. It's hard to navigate that conversation between law and grace. When I was at my first church in Ontario, I heard a speaker at one of our association rallies say this. He said, the church should be wrestling with the question, is this right? We should be wrestling with that question, is that right? We should be pondering, is what we're doing right? And I believe he's right. We should be spending a lot more time saying, is what we're doing right? Or is it wrong? For Joseph, if he divorced her quietly, then he's saying, like, I'm giving up my right for some type of payback for what she did. So these things here are all rolling around in Joseph's mind and making the situation even more harder and more awkward. Well, I wonder how many people today have found themselves in a similar situation. Something has happened that has caused them to be placed in an awkward situation that has them feeling hurt, betrayed, or angered. I believe that number would blow our minds if we really knew it. If we really understood that number. And this is not just people outside the church. Okay, I'm going to get a little geeky on you this morning. Okay, I'm going to give you some statistics. These statistics blew my mind this week. I couldn't believe it. Now, these are based on the United States, but I believe that in Canada it's very similar. The Christian research group Barna has data that indicates 28% of the adult population has not attended any church activities, including services, in the past 6 months. Right? So 28% have not attended church or any activity in the past 6 months. Now you might say, well, that's no surprise. You know, like, people don't like church anymore. All right? Keep listening. This translates to nearly 65 million adults. 65 million adults. If you add kids to that, it's about 100 million people. That's a lot of people. Now, here's the part that really blew my mind. 61% of these 65 million people are those who claim to be Christians, but they have been hurt by the church and walked away. 61%. Let me give you a figure. I said 65 million adults haven't attended church in the last 6 months. That means 40 million of them are Christians that were hurt by the church and walked away. 40 million people. Wow. Now, granted, the population of the United States is about 350 million, and we have 38 million. But I believe the same thing that happens in the States is happening in Canada. And I bet if you thought for a second about those who used to attend Wittenberg, and for one reason or another, they got hurt and they walked away, it would be a crazy number of people. See, the figures surprise us, but we know it's true. Because as soon as I gave those figures, I know that our minds jump to people who at one time sat in chairs around us, and now you look around and they're not here, and you can't remember the last time you saw them in church. That's truth. So, what does that mean for the local church? What does the story of Joseph, an awkward situation, what does that mean for the local church? Well, here's what it means. It means it's time for the church to have conversations with people that will lead to overcoming this awkward feeling that has been associated with church. It's time for those in the church to go and have coffees with people, talk with them, and try to help them overcome that awkward feeling, whatever the cause was. Perhaps the church had the right to feel hurt, betrayed, and angered. But that doesn't give the church the right to act negatively on that. And the same goes for the individual. Maybe the church did something to the individual, and the individual feels hurt, betrayed, angered. Well, I'm sorry, that doesn't give you the right to act negatively towards the whole church. But the only way to really address that is to have those awkward conversations that we don't really want to have. How many people like to have awkward conversations? Okay, we have a lot of honest people here. Nobody likes to have them. I don't like to have awkward conversations. But sometimes in order to rebuild bridges and reach people, we've got to have the awkward conversations. And we can't just pretend it doesn't exist. We could try, we can wish, we can hope, but it's not going to go away. You can't hide from the question. Because it's just like Joseph. You try to hide from the question, and sooner or later the truth is going to come out, right? Think of this for a second. If Joseph decided, I'm not going to deal with this right now, I'm going to deal with it later. How long is it going to be before Mary starts showing that she's pregnant? Right? Are you really going to hide that? How long can you hide that for before it comes out? Not that long. Sooner or later, the situation is going to come to light. If someone is hurt in the church and they decide to hide it instead of talking about it, then it's just a matter of time before they decide the hurt is too big, it's too grave, it can't be fixed, I'm walking away. And I've got 40 million people that would agree with that. And I've seen it happen. But if I had the choice of having an awkward conversation with someone that might lead, there's no guarantee. It's not like we can go have this conversation with somebody and think, well, now that I had this conversation, everything's going to be right, bridges are going to be rebuilt, everyone's going to be happy. No. There's no guarantee. There's no guarantee at all. But if I had the choice of having an awkward conversation with someone that might lead to bridges being rebuilt, relationships restored, and brothers and sisters coming back to the church, or staying in my comfortable little bubble while that bubble is safe and comfortable and predictable, well, it's not really a choice, is it? Because pleasing to God means we've got to enter into those awkward situations and show the mercy and grace that Jesus shows us. We have to enter into those conversations. Why? Because we were shown mercy and grace. So here's a challenge for this week. How are we going to deal with the awkward situations that we need to face this week or in the weeks to come? How are we going to deal with it? Are we going to say, my rights say this? The law says this? Everything tells me this? Or are we going to say, that might be my rights, but mercy and grace says this? And I'm going to decide to come over here, and I'm going to check my feelings, my hurts. I got to check these things over here, and I've got to come over to mercy and grace. Because it's through mercy and grace that we're going to reach people, not by hanging on to what we think are our rights. Let's pray. Oh, dear Jesus, we thank you so much for the story of Joseph and what we can learn. Lord God, we thank you that we can lean on you for everything that we need to deal with the awkward situations of life. We thank and we praise you. In your name, amen.